Alright, so welcome to our Unit 3 Culture section review. Keep in mind that culture is any of the material traits, customary beliefs, and social norms of a society. So basically, anything a society or culture does, feels, thinks, believe in, that is all going to make up their culture. There's going to be two parts of the culture. You have material culture and non-material culture. Material culture is like an artifact, anything you can touch or feel. Non-material culture is going to be more of your belief system, things you can think of, languages, religion, political association, what you think is more moral, how you treat different genders. That is going to be your non-material culture. Now, moving on, culture is kind of distinguished between two things. You have your habit, which again is just something that you personally do or few people do and hasn't caught on to everybody in the culture. Remember, my example in class is the glass of water every night before I have to go to bed. A custom, on the other hand, is going to be something that is frequently done by a majority of the people in a custom, or in a culture, sorry. Keep in mind, this does not have to be technical. You're not looking for 100%. You're just looking for an act that most of the people do over and over and over again as a part of one group. Customs can definitely be how you greet people, how you say goodbye to people, customary food, customary sports that are all part of your daily culture. We break these customs down. So remember, habit, individual, custom, everybody does. We break these two categories down, one by daily necessities. What do you do daily as a society? Something you repeat over and over and over. And then we also have leisure activities. So what do we choose to do in our free time? So we have things we need to do. So every culture definitely kind of needs to brush their teeth, wear different kind of clothing, etc. This is going to change from culture to culture. Now, what we do with our leisure activities is also always going to be different. Not every culture sits around and watches TV. Not every culture plays baseball. All right, different cultures have different free time activities. They all have free time. However, they all decide to do different things with their free time. Now, pop versus folk culture. Keep in mind, folk culture is static, which means that it stays still. It never really changes from place to place or from time to time. Now, again, folk culture doesn't have to be in different places. It's usually isolated in one spot. However, if folk culture is separated, it doesn't really change. The folk culture that's practiced in part A, if that same culture moves to B, they're going to be the same. However, there are going to be a variety of different folk cultures around the world that have their own individual beliefs that not everybody else participates in. Popular culture is going to be more dynamic, which means it's always changing, always switching things up, and this is going to be done by a large group of people of different backgrounds. This is usually a small group of people with the same background, ethnicity, culture, etc. Now, again, the origins of folk culture are pretty general. They're usually anonymous, unknown dates. We don't know who actually told it, and then originally, before it's written down, it was always told orally. Pop culture, on the other hand, this is going to be more of the developed countries. Think more Europe, think more North America. We normally can trace who exactly started it, who wrote the lyrics, the date it was made. We kind of know the origin behind it, and it was usually documented right away. However, folk culture, on the other hand, is not usually documented. That's mainly because we don't know who started it, and it was always transferred orally. The diffusion of it, how it kind of spreads from place to place. Folk is definitely going to be on a smaller scale, which means it's not going to go too far. It's not going to diffuse far. And then when it does diffuse, it's usually only through relocation diffusion. Pop culture, when it diffuses, usually through technology these days. All right, and it's going to be more hierarchical from the beginning. These important people said this is going to be the new trend. Once that catches on, then it's going to be definitely a bit more contagious, where kind of everybody has access to it, where things start to go viral a little bit. The distribution of it, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit more isolated for folk. Part of the reason why it's isolated is people have not been able to migrate. They're not able to move from place to place. Usually this is because of physical barriers is going to be kind of the main obstacle here for folk culture not to be going from one person to another person. Again, religion always has a role in this. Religion is going to help spread different folk culture. Think more about Hinduism and Judaism, where you see a lot of Jewish practices around the world. The explanation behind that is more because of religion has kind of spread that culture, not really through a contagious movement. Popular, on the other hand, it's widely distributed. People all across the world have access to it. Usually, the main obstacle to this is going to be economic, where you don't have the technology, you can't get to that pop culture. But if you do have money to it, you are going to be exposed because you are going to have that technology. Key differences here, kind of as a main example, folk versus pop. Remember, folk music usually about life cycle, something big in somebody's life, has some environmental background to it as well. Agriculture, changing of the seasons, and again, it's usually static, where it definitely does not change over time. The same lyrics, the same way it's performed is always going to be the same from time to time. And again, just the same thing as we kind of know before about folk culture. We don't know really where it began. We don't really know who started a lot of this stuff. Pop culture, on the other hand, we know exactly who made it, we know exactly who produced it, we know probably the day it was recorded, the day it came out. And what this means, it's always changing. So a song by Prince 25 years ago, that song's not going to change. But what is popular and what people are always listening to right now, what are they spending their time listening to right now, that has changed over the course of the last 25 or 30 years. All right, so that's what we mean by dynamic, different popularity. Now moving on kind of with folk sports, again, very traditional. It's always more of because of a belief or recreational. Pop sports is eventually going to be about more about money, more about consumerism. So we kind of use soccer in our kind of discussions, showing how soccer kind of went from being really folky, where it was just more of a recreational game, but once people started massively coming to this game, they started charging money. When they started charging money, you probably needed more rules. Rules became standard. All right, and now more and more people are now involved with soccer, and thus soccer today is going to be definitely more of the world sport, the more of the pop sport across the world. Even though it's played frequently in a lot of developing countries, it's going to be considered more popular because it's dominant in a lot of developed countries other than the United States. All right, but it has spread throughout the entire world. Alright, so now comparing and contrasting folk food with pop food. Keep in mind, just like you kind of already know about folk culture, environment has a huge impact on kind of the folk aspect to it. Food tastes differently based on the terroir kind of concept. Basically, it's the local environment's impact on the flavor or the taste. If you have a different climate, it's going to make grapes taste differently. If you have a different soil, it's going to make your fruit and vegetables taste a little bit different. So if you think about this from place to place or culture to culture, they're going to have their own kind of unique flavor with that food. And kind of with this, especially with ethnic cultures of sorts or folk cultures of sorts, you're going to have a lot of taboos. Remember, again, taboos have a lot of background into either religion or the local environment. There's always kind of a story behind it, but some of the few common ones we talked about, this kind of restriction on a social behavior, restriction on the culture. A few of them, Hebrews or Jewish people can't eat pork. Keep in mind, things that are done kosherly are associated with Jewish people. Kosher is more of a way things need to be prepared. Muslims also cannot have pork, unsuited for kind of dry climate. Remember, kind of they were basically competing for water of sorts in the dry, arid climate. So pigs served no true purpose, thus they became taboo. You shouldn't have them around. Hindus, because of kind of a backstory, they believe cows are sacred, thus beef is going to be more prohibited for Hindus in their culture. So kind of think about where this would be prevalent. You're not going to have a lot of pork butcheries of sorts in the Middle East, all right, and you're also not going to have a lot of cow butchery or cow sales or cattle sales when it comes to processing of the meat in India. All right, whereas if you think about maybe China, China has none of these restrictions. Therefore, China will probably have more pork and more beef consuming than India and the Middle East. Popular food, on the other hand, that does change by region, but think about more pop food when you um, think about more of the consumer aspect of it. Wine is popular kind of all over the world, all right, but it changes based on the local variety, local taste, and kind of background. So again, kind of with pop food of sorts, keep in mind the local behaviors are kind of dictated based on what they like. Because beer is prevalent, or excuse me, because grain is prevalent in the Midwest then became a huge beer industry. The South has a lot of pork on a lot of their menus, mainly because pork is usually raised in the South. Now that we kind of know a little bit of background of religion, keep in mind Mormons, Latter-day Saints are predominantly in Utah. This explains why there's a lot less alcohol in Utah because more of the religious restrictions in Utah. So Utah is going to be kind of exempt from kind of this popular food notion, especially when you discuss alcohol. All right. So kind of moving on to threats of access to popular culture. Basically, what can get in the way of popular culture? Keep in mind, it's usually lack of money, which therefore you can have technology. Or if you want to look at it, lack of technology, you don't get access to popular culture, but the reason behind that is more of lack of development, more of lack of economic security to have that technology. Um, Keep in mind, additionally, elements of folk culture can become popular kind of by being diffused through electronic media. This is the idea of kind of commodification. There's obviously another term we haven't really kind of talked about for this, but keep in mind if you try selling something based on folk culture into popular culture, basically you're taking an ethnic outfit and you're making it a little more trendy. The idea behind that is commodification. Same thing kind of way with the backpack idea we had here. Um, this is also usually done in a lot of different ethnic type places where people go for more tourist aspects. They'll go there, they'll put on these little rituals mainly for the tourists. They don't always practice these rituals, but tourists want to see this folk kind of aspect and they'll usually pay money for it. Keep in mind that's also kind of another way to actually spread your folk culture a little bit. Same thing we kind of talked about Victoria's Secret models and the Washington Redskins. It's not about the name the Redskins, is that they're trying to make money off of that ethnic culture, which is truly really popular culture. Again, this is popular culture, that's pop culture, and this is pop culture because you're showing it to all these tourists. Now, again, threats to folk culture. External threats, keep in mind, governments are usually worrying about social mobility, kind of that rags to riches story. They're threatened by the role of women, empowerment of youth, and embracing diversity. They want to keep their culture the same. They don't want women to have a bigger role. They don't want the youth to really have a say, and they don't want people to kind of move up in a different social status throughout their kind of not government but culture. A few of these examples, remember North Korea has a state-run media, therefore they're trying to keep out these external threats of popular culture, and they do so by having their own media and kind of blocking everything out. Another one of these examples was the Soviet Union. They kind of ran all their system through one building. Basically, all their media and news outlets were through this building. Therefore, they were trying to keep out all the external threats, which would be Western Europe and the United States, to try not to convince them. Remember, Soviet Union was under the communist bloc. If they see what the Western countries had and the United States had, that might be threatening because the people in the Soviet Union might be like, hey, that sounds pretty cool. We should probably start doing some of that stuff. And these governments did not want that to occur. Now, keep in mind, there's different ways to try to do this. Government tries to limit political content. They don't want you to see anything different than what they're believing. Social content. They don't want you to see gambling, sex on TV, things that kind of go with their background or their religious beliefs. They don't want to see armed conflict that they are a part of. They don't want to show that to you. This is another example of an external threat because they're not letting you see everything you need to see in that country. And then the kind of the final one, internet tools. Now, censorship in response, one of these case studies we're going to kind of look at is the Tiananmen Square kind of massacre. Looking at this was, keep in mind, you had all these youth people coming to kind of protest the anti-democratic regime of China at the time. It was met with violence, and even today, people in China are going to have a hard time kind of seeing this on television, in the internet, in the news, whereas the Western media at the time covered this predominantly throughout all the main news stations and news media outlets. This is one of the reasons kind of why the China today has the Great China Firewall, is to kind of protect the Western culture and the Western media infiltrating into China. So looking at the Arab Spring as kind of this case study is a little bit different than the Tiananmen Square. Remember, Tiananmen Square, nobody else really saw what was going on in China, so kind of the the protests, the anti-government policies, or the anti-government group really never took off after that because the government was able to shut it down. The Arab Spring is a good example of something that's contrasting to that a little bit. With the social media, they were able to text each other, message each other on social media, let each other know when and where to meet. Um, this led one country next to another country next to another country, also on social media, to see what's happening next to those places. Oh, it worked in country A, so we're going to do that here in country B, and we're going to meet and use social media to gather, have our meeting points, kind of have our revolts all set in stone and scheduled through social media. Previously, if you think about Tiananmen Square and China's government, they didn't have that technology at the time. They were not able to coordinate as well as those who participate in the Arab Spring. So this is an example of technologies kind of overcoming kind of these government blocks and these government shuts down of media, which does lend itself a little bit more to having more of these little small revolutions and revolts in a lot of these different countries around the world. So, some examples of sustainability issues for folk culture. Keep in mind, pop culture is always going to be the big threat to folk culture. Having more and more contact with Western culture is kind of going to be one of the biggest threats for folk culture. They see what the pop culture is like, they see what Western culture is like. Hey, this is a little bit easier in Western culture. Can we adapt this into our culture? Or you might start losing members of your folk culture to that popular culture because of seeing how difficult the old practices are and how easy it is kind of with that newer pop culture. Perfect example of this is going to be the Amish. Keep in mind the Amish moved from Europe into Pennsylvania is going to be a predominant spot, mainly because they were fleeing religious persecution. They needed to be farmers or wanted to be farmers, so they went to, and they always go to places where land is pretty cheap because they're not looking to make a lot of money, they're looking to live off of the land. So once you start having high land prices, high taxes, this is going to start moving a lot of Amish people out of kind of their realm into different spots. This is kind of the explanation about why a lot of the Amish today are kind of moving and relocating more towards the more Midwestern part of the United States, away from Pennsylvania, especially Philadelphia, because of urban sprawl. They're having more and more contact with Philadelphia. In addition, you have a lot of those tourist people who want to come around and start looking at the Amish people, taking pictures. This is going to have more and more impact with pop culture going into folk culture and folk culture not being able to sustain or keep going their kind of folk beliefs. Um, Second one here we're going to look at are gender roles in Saudi Arabia. Remember, this is kind of the new one that got thrown off a little bit because they eventually did change it. The issue here was to keep the full culture of women not to be able to drive. Remember, in Saudi Arabia, a lot of Middle East countries, males are more predominant than females when it comes to kind of power or social status. One of the things in Saudi Arabia, they did not want to have women drive. This was a very kind of conservative view. They always need to wear their garb, they always need to drive with a male. Keep in mind this restricts women's freedom. They can't go to work without a male, they can't drive to work without a male, they can't apply for a job without a male. Alright, so this really restricts women's ability to kind of be free in Saudi Arabia. Now, with social media and all these media campaigns that have been promoted through Twitter, different social media stuff on the internet, this is kind of churning the old ways into kind of a newer way in Saudi Arabia. They're pushing back the old ways, the folk ways, and trying to get something a little bit more progressive. And even as we talked about in class, women now are able to drive in Saudi Arabia. This doesn't come into effect till next year, but they did finally pass a law. So this is an example of how media, social campaigns can kind of drive and change social status within a full culture or within a kind of a country slash culture. Dowries in India. Keep in mind, dowries in India were made mainly because males were seen as more kind of quote special in India as opposed to females. Now, with that being said, there had to be some sort of a token gift that the bride's family had to give to the groom's family because the groom was going to then take care of the female the rest of her life. Alright, so in appreciation for this, you need to give a small token of appreciation to the groom's family. We're giving you our son. Our son is now going to take care of your daughter for the rest of time. Now, over the years, especially the last 60 to 70 years, a lot of people in India have been exposed to Western culture. They see how we do gifts in the Western culture, how we have overabundance of gifts, more consumerism. Now they've taken this back into dowries in India, where they want to start asking for cars, they want to start asking for high-end jewelry, TVs, plasma screens, etc., which are going to be very, very costly, especially in India, for these people to kind of match up with. And keep in mind, this has led to a lot of social issues in India. There's a lot of social conflict, especially more in the rural area where it's hard to police this kind of stuff. This is supposed to be illegal in India, but a lot of times it still does happen where a female's family cannot pay the groom's family off that dowry, and therefore they will either beat, punish, or even kill the bride that was kind of given in that marriage because they could not kind of pay off this deal, this dowry, if you will. So sustainability issues for popular culture. How can we keep popular culture going? One of the things is kind of the pushback against these uniform landscapes, the idea of placelessness. All right, we talked about this unit one. Kind of the reason this is a threat is because people are sick and tired of kind of getting off interstates and seeing this. This could be one of 1,000 different towns in the United States. You get off the interstate, you see a Perkins, you see some gas stations, you see a Taco Bell. Basically, all this looks the same. This is definitely trying killing local culture, and pop culture is kind of taking over, and now there's a little bit of a pushback against these uniform landscapes where people are now realizing, hey, this does not look like our city anymore. This is a placelessness type place. There's too much pop culture here. There's too much of a uniform landscape here. Um, Keep in mind, look how pop culture has kind of taken over the environment. This is a traditional landscape, a folk landscape of golf in Scotland. Notice how they're just using the natural environment to play golf. Whereas in the United States, they flatten, they level everything out. Everything's kind of made, quote, to order. Basically, the golf course is imposed on the landscape as a to just instead of just being part of the landscape. And the final kind of sustainable issue for popular culture is going to be having enough resources. All right, so if we need more houses, we're going to cut down more trees. All right, if we need more fur coats, we need to kill more animals for that. All right, we need more plastic products, therefore we're going to need more oil, which is going to go into the plastic products. Thus, it's going to eventually wear down, and before long, we might not be able to keep pop culture going because we're not going to have enough resources for it. So that's possibility of one of the threats to pop culture.